welcome to our podcast. Today we're going to be talking about project delivery performance. We're going to ask the question, we're actually quite good. Or actually, to make it a question, we're asking the question, are we really that bad, perhaps? So I'm joined by Paul Chapman from Saïd Business School. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, Andy.
And I'm joined by Nirmal, a member of our MPA board. Hi, Nirmal.
Good afternoon, Andy.
Okay, and the reason we're gathered for this podcast is that Paul has published a couple of reports recently. One looking at the delivery performance of roads projects in England, and another one, a similar report into Sweden. Before we sort of delve into the detail, I'm going to jump into one of the headlines. And Paul, in your study on English roads of major schemes, you showed that 93% have a positive benefits cost ratio and are typically delivered within budget. Changes to policy and practice improved cost performance over time. So there are your sort of headlines from the English road study. Similarly, for the Swedish road study, which also included rail, you found that project performance was very similar. In fact, 93%, and exactly the same number, was delivering a positive benefits cost ratio. These run counter to widely held position that transport infrastructure delivery performance and outcomes are persistently poor. So, Paul, are we just poor at owning the narrative on the value of and performance of major projects generally, or are your findings unique to roads?
Yes, I think the evidence we've got looks at transport infrastructure, so roads in England and then roads in Sweden and rail in Sweden. I was probably as surprised as you sounded when sort of crunching those numbers. Who knew they actually delivered net economic benefit and also delivered the intended benefits? And as you're saying, Andy, that is not the narrative that bounces around. So something interesting was going on there. And like I say, I wasn't expecting that. So that's on the benefits side, and then on the cost side, because we all know that big projects overrun. It turns out they don't. Most of those projects, typically those projects in 3 different populations, were delivered on cost, and actually, in many cases, under cost. So that was another quite surprising finding.
Yeah, and it was a surprising finding, given the overwhelming narratives that we hear of project performance. And you only have to do a quick Google and you'll hear of, or you'll quite quickly come up with all of the projects that have significantly overrun and so on. So perhaps it's a little bit unfair of me just to dive straight into that headline, but perhaps to balance it off, Paul, perhaps if you could just give us a bit more background to the reports and their sort of broader findings.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll try and keep this brief, and please jump in if you think it's not that brief, because I did get a bit fascinated by really diving into the data. So I think the big context was when looking around the infrastructure sector, where do governments spend their money? There's a really good bit of data publicly available through the G20 on InfoTracker, and it's in the order of 75% of public spend is on transport infrastructure. So mostly roads, mostly rail. In the UK, that's 83%. So it's a big amount of money. I'm not kind of deeply wedded to transport infrastructure, but the G20 data is also useful, which is what are the transformational outcomes that governments seek to achieve? And it turns out that transport infrastructure is the biggest contributor to the 4 main categories of transformational outcomes. So it's like, this is a big deal. There's a lot of money being spent here. I think some of the lessons could be applied to other sectors as well. So if folk are not necessarily transport buffs, hang on, there's something there for you too. One of the things that had caught my sort of attention over time likewise is, here's another failing project. And we kind of draw a conclusion from that. But we always seem to overlook the ones that worked well. And in the UK, we've got a lovely example, which is delivered by Transport Scotland it's the fourth road replacement bridge, the Queensferry crossing. So if you're ever up in Edinburgh, it's almost worth wandering over to go, wow, a third bridge. It's really iconic. It's a brilliant bit of engineering, but its main purpose is to provide social and economic benefits across the Firth of Forth. So it does that. It does it well, and it was delivered, roughly speaking, 30% below cost. Why do we not hear about that? So it's not just the press. So academic colleagues, it's almost the starting point for any paper written by an academic in our field, which is most projects run over cost and are rubbish in several other ways too. And it's just become a hackneyed phrase. And given the opportunity, I thought, I'm going to go after this. And when casting around, where's a reliable source of data? One of the places that I've found is quite useful is transport infrastructure. So that's kind of the reason I'm there.
Thanks, Paul. So that is fascinating, because I sort of think back to the sort of halcyon days of the 2012 games and the UK in particular. We had a bit of mojo, didn't we, in terms of project delivery? We felt that we could do anything, put the right talent to it, we would achieve it. And the narrative and the mood seems to have beaten us down a bit, that we now feel that it's are we really going to deliver on time? Can we really deliver the projected benefits and so on? One of the things that your study does, it's not just a static view, it's not just a snapshot of projects today. It's you've got a history, and you've plotted it, and you've sort of reviewed it over time. So perhaps this is a bit of a loaded question, but has delivery performance been static over that time, or are there examples from the Sweden study or the England one where changes to policy or practices has resulted in a sort of a notable difference?
And I think I'll go to Sweden first. So the time series I've got, that it's about 25 years of data on roads and about 17 years of data on rail. And the thing that's remarkable there is pretty consistently over a very long period of time, most projects came in on cost. It's like they've managed to hold that. And what's happened in that time period? We've had global economic crisis, we've had COVID. Things have happened in the big wide world that should blow projects off course, and yet they've been delivered effectively. The outlier, to some extent, was the data from England, which I think, being polite, there was some real challenges around cost control. So when I looked sort of earlier on in the sample, it wasn't a terribly happy story. Something happened. And then projects went from being kind of, between 10 and 15% cost overrun, that projects typically were being delivered around 7% under cost, and then continued over time. And so that's something happened at about 2007, 2008. And I must admit, I wrote that paper and I submitted it to a journal and thought, there you go, that's my contribution. And one of the reviewers, so most good journals will have two reviewers, there's this, that, and the other. And one of the reviewers just put, why? What happened there? Can you explain it?
That's a great segue to introducing Nirmal. So Nirmal, you were at Highways Agency around that time, and you were the major projects director for about just under 4 years, I think, so 2008-ish to 2011. We did see some significant change. I remember there was a report. I always refer to it as a Nichols report, but I think there were others as well. But from your perspective, can you explain what was going on? Is it explainable, the observation that Paul has made, that there was a change and then cost performance improved?
I think the answer is there's probably a bunch of things. I don't think there was an individual silver bullet. But when I reflect back on my time there, it's probably worth, actually, Andy, going into the Nichols review slightly, because the Secretary of State of the day, Douglas Alexander, he commissioned the late Mike Nichols to do a review on the performance of the roads program of the day, because he had concerns about the Highways Agency's approach to cost estimating and project management. And he also asked Mike to make recommendations on how the agency should better assess, monitor, and report on risks to cost estimates. So that was kind of the brief to Mike Nichols. And Mike sort of concluded that estimating was really not a strength at that time. And he said, look, principally, this is because the agency keeps getting inflation wrong. But he said that's hardly surprising given that you're making an estimate 10, 15 years in advance. So in that sense, he made a bunch of recommendations coming out of his review. And I'll just give you the three headlines. First one was the agency should restructure its sort of delivery into three phases. And typically that meant options, development, delivery. So in other words, creating stage gates at which time you kind of restate your estimate, because that's when a lot can change. You can de-risk the project as you go through the development stage. He recommended significant improvement in the governance between the highways and its principal stakeholders in the DFT. And more significantly, he said, look, the agency needs to improve its estimating, its risk management, its procurement, and fundamentally its delivery capability. So he made a bunch of recommendations sitting underneath all of that. My role was one of those recommendations. So I was recruited as Major Projects Director in April 2008. And at that time, I was the fifth Major Projects Director in 12 months. So in terms of the baseline that I sort of inherited, I think it's worth stressing here that it's more than just cost, because if we just focus on cost, we ignore some of the softer aspects of delivery that enable, if you like, future success. So, I mean, what I inherited fundamentally, as I said, I was number 5 in 12 months, which meant that there was no stability in leadership. And I think that in itself is a key criterion in terms of creating a recipe for success. There was obviously a loss of credibility that came out of the Nichols review, because this was taking the Highways Agency and all its people and its supply chain through the kind of the press mire for months on end. Health and safety wasn't good. It was at the AFR of the day, accident frequency rate was about 0.4. Staff morale was the lowest. The Highways Agency used Gallup to measure staff engagement. And the Major Projects Directorate, which I was inheriting, were in the bottom 3% of the global Gallup database, which says morale was in an all-time low. I just asked the question, how are you going to get people to excel when mood is that low? The supply chain was not aligned. And I'll give you a simple example of that. I spoke to all the senior executives of all the supply chain, and I kind of said to them all, look, Nichols is questioned at the Highways Agency on its performance, its capability. But when I reflect on it, the agency is a pretty light client. It kind of relies heavily on the supply chain. So question, if the HA has tried to reinvent itself through the Nichols review, what have you done to change your business model? And there was silence. So it was pretty obvious that the supply chain was clearly not aligned. So there's a whole bunch of things that, for me, created my target operating model thinking in terms of what I needed to do. And maybe we can explore some of that as we progress.
Yeah, thanks, Nirmal. We'll follow up on a couple of those in a moment. Clearly, the devil is in the detail. And just following up on your point about cost overruns not being, the only one thing we need to focus on, Nirmal, focus on some of those other softer aspects as well. But one of the findings in your report, Paul, just want to pick up on, you mentioned it before as well, but you do say that before 2007, And then after 2007 seems to be this sort of moment where things changed, and your data was showing a sort of an 11.5% average cost overrun across the portfolio. And I guess there'll be some horrific outliers in there as well in that sort of long tail. But then after 2008, you started to report an overall cost underrun, so that the cost improvement at the portfolio level was showing that most projects, or not most projects, but projects on the whole, were coming in under the budget as a whole. But coinciding with that change from 2008 onwards, there was also the number of projects that fell below their expected benefits increased. But I think you also find that the overall benefits of the portfolio went up. So it feels like there could be an increased risk taking in terms of the specification or the delivery approach for the benefits you're likely to get, or there might be some other things going on, and I guess I might be leaping at a conclusion too far there. But from your perspective, Paul, what can we make of this sort of dual aspect of the cost performance improving, but then perhaps the benefits cost ratio dropping on one of the measure, but improving on another measure?
Yeah, what we have to be really cautious of is, do particular examples illustrate something wider or not? So it's a bit like health. I was coming back from my run this morning, Andy, get me, polishing my halo, and coincided with school drop off. There's some poor bloke is kind of coming back from dropping off his young lovely, and he's sparked up a cigarette and he's coughing away like nobody's business. And I'm kind of thinking, fella, you must realise that this isn't good for you. But for every there's somebody kind of not in a good state of health is another story. Well, my nan smoked 2 packs every day from when she was 12 to when she was run over by a bus at 90. So individual examples, people in health and individual projects may not be a great indicator. So what we need to do is a little bit like public health, which is kind of use the data. So I think what you pointed to, something really interesting. And when looking at that data, it wasn't statistically significant on benefits. So
Right.
it looks like there's something there, but the evidence isn't strong enough to go, it's sort of just ebbing and flowing a little bit. What is statistically different is ability to deliver on cost. So,
Yeah. Okay.
yes, we're all interested in the benefits and the outcomes, but we kind of only get there with project management effectiveness. Did you deliver it on cost? Is a great place to start. And what we see is a material difference in the performance of that portfolio. And it's one side of a divide. If I may be so bold, Nirmal is just being ridiculously modest.
He always is.
Because something happened, and I know it's all about a team, but teams are often, kind of really inspired by the captain. And what's also great about this study, and it's kind of, and I got to it by this reviewer saying, well, what happened and why, is really robust evidence. There's the Nichols report, we've kind of mentioned that already, but in a contemporaneous fashion, there's also a Public Accounts Committee report on exactly the same thing, which is informed by a National Audit Office audit of exactly the same thing. And everything points in the same direction. The things, Nirmal, you describe are described in all of those independent sources of saying, this is what was wrong, look what has been done. And the National Audit Office is a follow-up report of they've put it in place. And if you want a little bit more evidence, there's publicly available documents such as the annual report. And in most of the annual reports for the kind of next few years, there's a page or so on what are we doing about the transformation. So it's Graham Dalton reporting on what's been done. Now that's a legal document and it's been audited. So we've always got to keep our doubt in mind, but we see evidence, and really strong evidence. I've not seen as good contemporary evidence before of what happened. And then in the data, we can see the impact it had. So it's never quite slam dunk, But the other takeaway from this is, for people who are doing other sorts of delivery of other sorts of major projects, you could do a lot worse than look at that summary. What did Nirmal and his team put in place? Better cost estimating, strengthened appraisal and review, a procurement strategy that I think you very eloquently described as engaging that wider community of contractors who work together with you, program management, and who knew learning lessons from one project to the next and putting them into place. It's like, it's that hard, but it's also that easy.
And Nirmal, is that replicable across other types of major project organizations?
From my point of view, Andy, look, highways was my second formal rodeo. First one was at Anglian Water, where I was heavily involved in developing the At-One Alliance model, which is predicated on collaborative behaviors and proper alignment. And since the highways, I spent 12 years with UK Power Networks, where again, the kind of the foundation principles were broadly the same. So I would argue that it's entirely exportable. I think the fundamentals are agnostic to the sector. But I think what is important is that there are 3 or 4 things, subject areas, that have to be absolutely right. I mean, I mentioned a couple of those earlier, so let me start with people. I think you ignore people at your peril. Having people who are continuously told they're no good is not going to be a recipe for getting the best out of them on any given day. And there was something quite interesting that, as I kind of dug deeper into that conclusion that was coming through, it didn't take too long to figure out that all the project managers in the Major Projects Directorate were being assessed against this thing called the PPM framework, which is a spectrum of competence. But it also transpired that they were being judged across the entire life cycle of a project. Now, when you think about a life cycle of a roads project, that could be 15, 20 years old. Now, I had individuals who are absolutely brilliant at the upfront public inquiry stage. They were absolutely brilliant at the development stage, or they were absolutely brilliant at the construction stage. I only had one individual who had seen one project through its entire life cycle. So I changed the rules of the game. And I said, okay, why don't we judge people in each of those phases and then play them to their strengths? Yeah, I don't want a bunch of goalkeepers making it my first 11. So that in itself, what that did, it kind of got the people on side because they were good people at the end of the day. Yes, I had to strengthen some specific pockets within the org structure, but by and large, the majority of the people I'd inherited were good people. And suddenly we found that once we started judging them on their sphere of expertise, suddenly their PPM score absolutely rocketed. And then we had, instead of 90% not fit for task, we had 10% who might need a bit of development training. So getting the people on side. In terms of the supply chain, the simple response there was we created something called a principals group, where all the execs, we met 4 or 5 times a year, but the whole objective of that was to get them aligned to things that mattered to the highways agency. We started with health and safety. So I'd get the executive from that organization, which might have had an injury since the preceding meeting, to stand in front of his or her peer group, explain what had happened, why it had happened, and what he or she was going to do to make sure it never happened again. And that is quite a sobering task when you're doing that in front of your competitors. And over time, we created work streams with different members of the principals group leading on. So we had a health and safety work stream. We replicated that for customer service. And in the end, we started doing that for efficiency. So what are we doing on this project that could be replicated here? And that laid the foundations for redefining, if you like, the relationship with the supply chain. And one of the products from that, which is still there today, is something called the Roads Academy. We examined the capability across the whole ecosystem, and we concluded that actually we were lacking in terms of all the key leaders in our ecosystem needing to know the fundamentals and being absolutely clear on it. So we commissioned a master's kind of program through, I think it was Warwick. It was Warwick day one, and we put all the leaders from the ecosystem through it. And guess what? Everyone contributed to the cost of that program, and that is still running today. If you read up on the Rhodes Academy, it's still there, 15 years on. So there's a couple of things, but I think go on.
No, well, that's really fascinating because you opened up right at the beginning to say there was no silver bullet, and you're bit by bit you're explaining that this sort of system of capability that was needed to be put in place. And I love the fact that you talk about it wasn't change the team wasn't actually the answer. And coming back to your football analogy, how often do we see that a team's not scoring enough goals and the answer is a new striker, but there's something else going on there that's actually the cause or the effect of why they're not getting the ball into the right place to give it to their star striker. I probably can't sort of use that analogy too much more, but hopefully people get the sense of that. So we mentioned earlier that the population as a whole, when we stop looking at individual projects, the portfolio that you looked at, Paul, the cost overruns sort of balanced out the cost underruns. So at portfolio level, I guess it was performing at P50, which is what we'd expect. But Professor Bent Fluberg talks about regression to the tail. So can we think about our major projects in this way when you're talking about the population, where a specific project might be so different that it then has that tendency to go massively out of control and skew the data overall? How do we guard for that?
I think we need to get a good sense of the data. So one of the things I've done in these three studies, so roads in England, roads in Sweden, railway projects in Sweden, is try to get the whole population. So it's not a sample. So it's all of the projects that were delivered in that time period. And as I was saying earlier, it's quite an extensive time period to get a sense of some will go quite considerably over, but also some were quite considerably under. We've got projects in all of the studies that are 50% of the estimated cost.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of wildly overestimated. But the thing that we're looking at a portfolio level is not the individual bits. It's what's the trend. So if we're thinking about capital efficiency, we want the overall amount to be on that P50. Mm-hmm. So yes, some will be over, some will be under, but they net out. And in all three examples, they net out. So we might have in mind, what's the P70, 80, 90, but if that's what we funded against, it'd be really inefficient capital allocation. So getting a better sense of the typical. There will be some outliers, and again, a little bit of stats is important here. So there's two ways of trying to measure the central tendency in a distribution, and one of them's the average. If you've got outliers, that average gets skewed. What you should look for is the median, so the middle value, and colloquially typical. Hey, Andy, what's the typical cost overrun? Is the right question, not what's the average. And the typical is a much better indicator of how do things work out overall, and from a finance point of view, is a more accurate way of trying to understand it. So one of the other ways of just crunching that data was, do big projects have higher cost overruns? No, is the quick answer in all the examples. Big projects are not more risky. Well, that said, they may be more risky, but the organisations involved have got policies and practices that were entirely capable of managing those risks. So we need to look at that data. The other thing that I'll kind of pin onto your question as well is, if you don't believe me, that's entirely fine. So be as skeptical as you want. But I've used publicly available data from reliable sources. I've published the data set for the English project to go, this is the data and this is where it's from. And so you can go back to the source. Now, I kind of do that because there's always the chance I made a fatal mistake. So please, somebody come and, look at those numbers and verify for yourself. In doing so, it's the first example in our field of where somebody goes, here's my work, here's my findings, but here's my data. So draw whatever conclusions you decide from that, which is, if you can't see the data, do you trust the claims that people are making from their research?
Thanks, Paul. And the links to your two studies will be in the podcast notes, and also they're already in the MPA's knowledge library, which you can find on the website. So the links to the studies are there, and obviously then the onward link to the data can be found as well. Paul, we've been focusing on the England study, principally because we've got Nirmal here and we can ask him questions about what the hell was going on. But the Sweden study, what can we learn from that? I mean, the 93% sort of, I guess there's a chance element to that, but the coincidence of both performing about the same, I found interesting. Obviously, the sample size there is two nations, but what can we draw from the Sweden study that might be of interest to us here in the UK?
Yeah, and I think the danger with the England study is, like I say, we look at this time series, we see this change, we've got this evidence, we've got Nirmal, and we just end up going, yeah, in a world of rubbish project delivery, every now and then a hero stands forward, and it's kind of, it's a freak result by an amazing person at the right time. And we could end it there. And I think what the Sweden study shows is going, no, it wasn't just in England. It was also in Sweden, and it was in roads, but also it was in rail. So it's a different asset class. So, right, that's three big studies, publicly available data, reputable sources. The one thing which is kind of overlaps is both nations do 5-year after opening studies. So that's how we've got confidence. In the UK, it's measured on BCR, but actually in Sweden, they use net present value. And like I say, the 93% deliver their benefits is just one of the kind of those complete coincidences, because they used slightly different methods to get to their evaluation. But the Swedish number is really reliable. They've got a long history of delivering transport infrastructure with a reputable organisation and supply chain. They've got their Auditor General all over this, kind of ... And, the Scandinavians, if nothing else, are noted for their kind of candidness. So, right, we've got road and rail. Interesting that we're also not seeing these dramatic cost overruns which are being talked about elsewhere. If there was one example of systematic bias in planning, it was on benefits. And one of the bits of evidence is that at investment decision, the benefits were underestimated, which again goes completely counter to the thing you keep hearing. Oh, investment decision, people make up really big benefits number and undercook the costs. None of that comes out in that data.
And that's really interesting because it aligns with a recent report published by the National Audit Office around values from public sector programs. And they did a review of 6 completed projects, some of them 20 or so years in the past. So looking at the post-project benefits that have been realised in some cases, quite some time afterwards. And they found in most cases there are additional benefits that hadn't been anticipated in the original business case. And I suspect part of that is because we have a very prescriptive appraisal regime for what goes in and what can't go in when we are comparing Project A with Project B with Project C on our infrastructure projects. The Green Book requires us to do that. So maybe something that we might consider as a community is do we allow other things to be included so that we're not underplaying our benefits and therefore potentially not going ahead with some projects that would otherwise be worthwhile doing. But perhaps that's a completely different podcast or even seminar or study that we could follow up with. So Nirmal, as a practitioner, you've had a chance to read Paul's reports. Obviously, we've been sort of grilling you and asking you questions. It's sort of your chance to reflect now, or perhaps even pose a question back to Paul. But what were your takeaways from the two studies?
I'm obviously closer to the UK one, and it was. I'll be honest, it was very nostalgic because it was 15 odd years ago, and it took me right back. And it was very nostalgic, very sentimental. But I think the takeaway for me, and it's not just the highways, but elsewhere as well, is that there is a way to get this right. And sometimes we maybe overcomplicate things. We focus on all the negative exceptions, and maybe the time is right now to provide equal voice to saying, okay, well, those projects were successful. What can we learn from them? Because I rarely see, and this is, and I'm as guilty as anyone else, because in every post I've been in, I'll kind of manage by exception, and I'll focus a lot of my effort on the projects in distress. We'll have some focus on, okay, that one's done really well. What can we learn from that for the next one? But human nature is such, and the demands of these roles are such, that you are judged by your failures, less by your successes. So maybe we need to change the narrative. Would be not change it, but at least add to the narrative. Would be a key takeaway for me, Andy.
Brilliant. I guess also that you're sort of judged on your last project as well, so which may be a completely different context to the previous one. So final question to both of you. So Paul, you lead the Major Projects Leadership Academy on behalf of UK government, where we put sort of our top civil servants through that regime, and Nirmal, you chair our programme committee on behalf of the Major Projects Association. So there's elements in there about policy and practice, but what could we be sharing with our members and all with your cohorts on MPLA that they should be thinking about when they're either setting up a capability within an organisation or perhaps they're leading an individual project? Nirmal, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think I might have referenced this in other places, Andy, but I think when we start a major project, start with this concept of pre-mortem thinking, which is, what could kill the patient? But this is more than just your conventional risk assessments and risk universe. But what are the fundamental things across all the softer things, the harder things that could take the project off track and bake the answers in from the outset? I don't think we do enough of that, in my view, and that's kind of a part of the agenda that I'd want to promote through the program committee next year.
Brilliant, thank you, Nirmal. So, Paul, what are you sort of following up on with your MPLA cohorts?
There's a bit of a fancy term, which is delivery is probabilistic, not deterministic. So again, a bit like health. Yeah, do these things increases your likelihood of, it doesn't guarantee. So there's always a chance that you can do all the great things that Nirmal's described, and you can do them with confidence they are the right things and still come in 20% over cost just because, the ebb and flow of the world. But that's where we do need to put things into context and perspective, which is but overall. So there's advice, good practice for individual project leaders, do these things. There's also advice for people who have oversight of portfolios, the National Audit Office, the PAC, the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, that they can't just go after the ones and twos that kind of prove to be outliers and then try to go, there's a problem with the system and therefore we need to do this corrective action for everything. So, we need to put 30% onto every budget just means you'll have really ineffective capital allocation. And we haven't got 30% extra cash. And there's a bit here going, no, it's okay. because if there's some overspends, there will be some underspends, because the policy and the practices are correct. And then for the individuals, it is somewhat different. So that ability to go portfolio and project and see the two at the same time. The other really hard thing is the lag between the effort that's put in, the delivery, and then the ability to do a post-delivery evaluation and get that data. So some of this data took a while to kind of pull together. So if you're doing this in real life, in real time, the actions that people do now, you won't be able to evidence them for possibly 2, 3, 4, 5 years to go, was it the right thing? And that holding the nerve can be really difficult. And then it might be that it wasn't the right thing. So that's one of the big problems. One of the things that I think could take away is just the sense of confidence. So, Nirmal, as you stride forth into new challenges, I hope you take with you, I knew I was right. And we've got the evidence. Some bloke from Oxford said, I was right. I bloody knew it at the time. But also have that confidence that doing this delivers the right results. And I do hope others follow suit, get their own evidence, kind of do a little bit of what I've done. I'm not a maths whiz. If I can do it, others can do it. But get that data, put it together into a spreadsheet, look at the trend, and then go, what's causing success? And I think some of the actions that you've done, Nirmal, really go, that's what caused success, and it works. And they're kind of broad enough and robust enough that I think they'll apply in other sectors too.
Brilliant. Yeah, and my takeaway, just following up on yours, Paul, was I think from the opening remarks that we're actually quite good. And you mentioned confidence there. I mean, confidence is infectious, and that means low confidence is infectious. So we stop doing things that would otherwise deliver, social impacts and economic benefit. And if we've got higher confidence, we'll be doing more things that have a greater impact, and it becomes that virtuous circle. So I think a theme that perhaps we can pick up on across our members is, let's get our mojo back. Let's start pushing those boundaries again and deliver some fantastic projects. Right, I'm going to leave it there because we aim to make these a decent dog walk or a horrible commute. I think we're probably in the boundary of one to the other. So hopefully those listening to this are either home safely or just about to finish their walk. And look forward to welcoming you again sometime soon. So thank you, Nirmal. Thank you, Paul. And good luck, Nirmal, in your next role.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you, Andy.